it's a first. A commercial flight has made history, flying from Israel to the United Arab Emirates. It comes after the two countries agreed to normalise relations. The word peace has been freshly painted on the side of the plane in Arabic, English and Hebrew. An Israeli delegation is on board, as well as US aides who helped broker the agreement. Among those is President Trump's son-in-law and Middle East advisor, Jared Kushner. Have a listen.
The first commercial flight in history between Israel to a Gulf Arab country. While this is a historic flight, we hope that this will start an even more historic journey for the Middle East and beyond. I prayed yesterday at the wall that Muslims and Arabs from throughout the world will be watching this flight, recognizing that we are all children of God and that the future does not have to be predetermined by the past. This is a very hopeful time, and I believe that so much peace and prosperity is possible in this region and throughout the world.
Jared Kushner there. Well, our Middle East correspondent Yolande Knell has been following the story from Tel Aviv, Israel.
The start of a new era. Top US aides with Israeli officials heading for talks in the UAE on opening up embassies, travel and trade. And making history, El Al Flight 971 is leaving Tel Aviv directly for Abu Dhabi.
Very good.
But I'm trying out a 30-second Israeli test for COVID-19, which is already set to be used at Abu Dhabi Airport. This startup's done a deal with a firm in the UAE.
That's where we translate the smell or the molecules into a digital signal.
High-tech is one reason why the Gulf state now wants Israel as a friend, not an enemy.
COVID-free. I've been hoping for Israel to become a part of the Middle East and to be closer and create a way for cooperation to unify ourselves around technology, around health, innovation.
Even without formal ties, in recent years, ministers from Israel have visited the Emirates. Two countries are both strong military powers that fear Iran's regional ambitions.
Behind this is a recognition on the part of the UAE that Israel has certain capacities that could become very useful if both countries became threatened. If the region suddenly went to a much more dangerous level of escalation.
But Palestinians call the normalisation agreement a stab in the back. In the past, the Arab world promised recognition for Israel only when their conflict was solved.
I would tell the Israeli side they can have normalization with all 22 Arab states. They still have a military occupation alive. And until they decide to get that boot off of our neck, they have not made progress one iota.
Abu Dhabi until Tel Aviv.
With direct contact now allowed, some young Emiratis and Israelis chat online. As relations flourish with the UAE, Israel hopes that more Arab states will soon follow its lead. Yolande Knell, BBC News, Tel Aviv.
Well, joining us live from Abu Dhabi now is Nick Marsh, Assistant Editor-in-Chief of the national newspaper. Nick, thanks very much for joining us. It is quite hard to underestimate how historic this moment is.
Absolutely. There's an economic story at work here and there's a political story. The economic one is embodied by this first commercial flight from Israel to Abu Dhabi, and we'll see some deeper commercial and economic ties, I suspect, agreed over the next couple of days. The political story is obviously that the US administration says that this re-energizes the prospects for a two-state solution.
And that's the point, isn't it? While it's being described as hopeful and a start of a new era, many Palestinians and Arabs are angry about this. Palestinians have described this as a betrayal and a stab in the back.
Well, I think for today we need to focus on the economic story and the historic nature of the Abraham Accord, which was agreed on August the 13th. And in the 2 weeks since then, we've seen the abolition of the Israel boycott law in the UAE. We've seen intense cooperation between representatives from the UAE and Israel on investment, on finance, health, and so on. That's really the story today. The political story will roll out, I'm sure, in due course.
And of course, there are also many who are saying this really raises the significance of the UAE in the Arab world when we look at things like the buying of weapons from Americans, which the UAE is looking at as well following this deal.
So UAE foreign policy is based on this broad commitment to de-escalation, dialogue and diplomacy. And this is a kind of natural extension of that. UAE officials will talk about the country being a beacon of tolerance. And this feels, in one respect, again, a natural extension of that.
And I know that you're saying the focus needs to be on today and the flight and this historic moment, but of course things like the annexation of the West Bank still remains on the table.
Well, that was a key element in the Abraham Accord, is that it froze the annexation in exchange for the process of normalisation of ties, which officials here saw as a key victory. It provides the space to re-energise the two-state solution, to talk about a longer lasting peace.
So they have received a guarantee that the annexation won't happen in the future?
It's in the accord that there is a suspension, a freeze, a halt of annexation.
Nick Marsh, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. That's Nick Marsh from The National.